Welcome to History 112, Lecture 43, The Cold War and the Vietnam Crisis. By the time JFK comes into office, there's a need within the American government to change how it's approaching the Cold War. Now, Ike's massive retaliation concept does not really respond to the real world at this stage, and it's unable to respond to the emerging Soviet influence in the Third World. Now, JFK is going to be supported with new ideas like special forces that could aid local troops in fighting guerrilla wars, which would be particularly important in many third world countries. And he also wants to use foreign aid and the Peace Corps, or student volunteers, to help developing nations stabilize and develop their economies. And JFK feels that those types of things are going to really help steer the Cold War back to, and the balance of nations back towards the West and back towards democracy. Now, before JFK could put a lot of his ideas into practice, tensions with the Soviet Union are going to hit an all-time high, and there's going to be quite a bit of crises for JFK to deal with, first starting with the Bay of Pigs. Now, under Eisenhower, the CIA had trained 2,000 Cuban exiles to invade Cuba and depose the communist dictator Castro, and they expected a mass uprising in support. When the uprising didn't occur, JFK is going to pull the planned U.S. airstrikes against Cuban forces and cut his losses. Now, this is seen as something of a foreign policy debacle, and when JFK goes to meet with Khrushchev, Khrushchev is going to make veiled threats of war over West Berlin. And in order to stop East Germans from fleeing, Khrushchev is going to go ahead and build the Berlin Wall, or what the Soviets called an anti-fascist protection rampart, and the whole idea being to wall in the West. Now, in October 1961, following the building of the Berlin Wall and its rise in tensions, JFK finds out that the Soviet Union is building sites in Cuba to base nuclear weapons. JFK blockades the island. There's a Soviet fleet transporting weapons on its way to Cuba. JFK prepares for airstrikes against missile sites. Everyone expects World War III when Khrushchev offers a settlement. The United States will lift the blockade and agree not to invade Cuba. The Soviet Union will not station nuclear weapons in Cuba. And that seems to be a fair deal. What we didn't know until 1992 is that many smaller nuclear weapons were already in Cuba, and it was intended to use them if there was any direct action against the island. And this point does really mark the point where World War III and an all-out nuclear confrontation with the Soviet Union was at its closest point to becoming a reality. With things like Cuba falling by the wayside, the Cold War again returns to the balance of countries and how they lean in the Third World, and an important battleground becomes Vietnam. Now, to review, the first Indochina War went like this. There was a communist leader named Ho Chi Minh who is going to win major victories against France. Eisenhower decided not to intervene directly, but is going to loan money to France in an attempt to keep control of their former colony. Now, the issue is ultimately going to be added to the Geneva talks, where the Korean War is being settled, and that's going to divide Vietnam into two. Now, as a result, what you have is in North Vietnam, where there's very little French influence, many people live in traditional villages, it tends to be poor, and the government helps redistribute food to starve off famine, and this results in a hugely popular regime, and many of the opponents of the regime are going to leave for South Vietnam in 1954. As a result, what you have is you have near universal support in North Vietnam for the communist regime there because A, the regime gave a lot to people and were able to buy a lot of support by making sure that everyone was fed, and B, the opponents of the regime had all left. Now, with regards to South Vietnam, this was a recently settled area with many ethnic and social divisions. It was a more prosperous region, had no threat of famine, and a large westernized middle class and many French-speaking people, and it overall lacked the unity of the North. Now, where the North could get behind a single regime, the South could not. Now, when the French withdraw, the United States are going to step in and prop up the South Vietnamese government, and in particular their leader Diem, who was an aristocratic Catholic with no real ties to the South. But the one thing he had going for them was that he was never seen to have collaborated with the French. Now, the CIA is going to help him suppress many of his challengers, some of whom were criminals, but many were not. And by the time we get to 1956, what we have is Diem firmly in control. Now, there were supposed to be all Vietnam elections that year that were agreed to under Geneva Accords, and the two Vietnams idea was only supposed to be temporary. Now, Ho is expected to win a landslide in these elections because he has complete support in the North and many supporters in the South, whereas Diem is supported by only a handful and is using things like the CIA to stay in power. So Diem refuses to allow the election to go forward, and the United States backs him on this. Now, by 1959, he is going to begin hunting down pro-communist people and pro-communist factions. And as a result of all this, the Soviet Union is going to go ahead as a general principle to back what they call wars of national liberation as a main method to combat U.S. influence rather than direct confrontation, and they're going to apply that immediately to Vietnam. Now, when the Soviets began looking at Vietnam as a place where they could help back a war of national liberation, what you have is a very divided country in the South. In particular, there's one group called the Viet Cong, who are allied nominally with the North Vietnamese government, and they're committed to the overthrow of Diem. They're not necessarily communists, however. These are people that simply oppose the South Vietnamese regime. And they're going to wage a campaign in the countryside and assassinate local officials to help destabilize the country. And these are people that are going to go ahead and receive increasing Soviet support and are over time going to lean more towards the communists. But in the beginning, they are simply people who are against the South Vietnamese government. On top of that, Buddhists are a minority in the country, and Diem is forcibly trying to convert these people to Catholicism, and many Buddhist monks are going to take to publicly committing suicide as protests, and it's going to generate a lot of bad press and lead to an overall decline in American support. And by 1963, JFK gives tacit approval to a coup by South Vietnamese generals. Now, LBJ is going to inherit an absolute mess in Vietnam at the end of 1963, but his response is initially very measured, and he decides to expand U.S. military advisors in country by about 5,000, and to keep that in basically the mid-20,000s for a little while. But in August 1964, LBJ tells Congress that U.S. destroyers were attacked by North Vietnamese forces, and Congress almost unanimously approves what's called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which allows the president to take all necessary measures. And LBJ regards this as a blank check to fight whatever type of war in Vietnam he needs to, and he begins the regular bombing of the North, and he begins to increase troop numbers. By the end of 1965, there's 100,000. By 1967, there's 500,000. Now, all of these U.S. troops pouring in country are going to allow a reasonably stable government in South Vietnam by the end of 1965, but the countryside, by and large, is in the hands of the Viet Cong. And again, in 1965, we're talking about people who are opponents of the South Vietnamese regime, not necessarily communists, but by 1965, this is going to be leaning much more strongly towards the communist spectrum than it had been in, say, 1963. Now, this begins the phase of the war known as the Quagmire. Now, the United States believed, ultimately, that mass airstrikes and constant battle would eventually wear down the Viet Cong and also their North Vietnamese allies, and once that was done, they would be forced to settle. Now, once U.S. troops are in country in any kind of strength, for all intents and purposes, the United States is going to win every battle of the war. Now, the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese are only really effective at hit-and-run attacks, and it's suspected that eventually they'll run out of strength. Now, also by 1967, within North Vietnam, every identifiable target of value had been destroyed by those airstrikes. So the United States turns to a policy of pacification by responding to Viet Cong threats and helping with the needs of the countryside. And it's never going to be very successful, and ultimately going to be displaced by a policy of relocating people from the villages to the cities where it was easier to control the population. The problem in short was this: the United States was unable to defeat the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese, even having destroyed every target of value, and they're simply unable to grind them down. Now, the United States is also going to be unwilling to withdraw, as this would appear weak to the Soviet Union and China, and also the United States is going to be unwilling to expand the war due to fear that the Soviets or the Chinese would intervene directly to aid Vietnam, as had happened in the Korean War. Now, to make matters worse, from late 1965 on, there's increasing domestic opposition to the war, and until 1968, the majority of people were holding on to the idea that victory was just around the corner, but they're starting to abandon this idea as there seems to be no identifiable end. And the war ultimately is going to be sapping money from federal programs and derailing Johnson's Great Society and driving large-scale inflation within the United States. Now, the myth that peace was just around the corner was destroyed by the Tet Offensive and Khe Sanh. These were major offensives that took the U.S. military by surprise, and Americans watched it live on TV. While the United States ultimately won in this particular engagement, they saw the U.S. ambassador to Vietnam having to barricade himself in his office, being defended by a handful of Marine guards because the Viet Cong soldiers were in the lobby. They saw U.S. Marines surrounded, being shelled, and while we ultimately prevailed in those conflicts, it destroys the myth that peace is around the corner and that the North Vietnamese and then the Viet Cong had no fight left in them. And it has huge political consequences, and in response to this, LBJ gets on TV and makes an announcement that shocks the country.
I have concluded that I should not permit the presidency to become involved in the partisan divisions that are developing in this political year. With American sons in the field far away, with America's future under challenge right here at home, with our hopes and the world's hopes for peace and the balance every day, I do not believe that I should devote an hour or a day of my time to any personal partisan causes or to any duties other than the awesome duties of this office, the presidency of your country. Accordingly, I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president. But let men everywhere know, however, that a strong and a confident and a vigilant America stands ready tonight to seek an honorable peace and stands ready tonight to defend an honored cause, whatever the price, whatever the burden, whatever the sacrifice that duty may require.
In the wake of Johnson's announcement that he would not run again, things in the country really heat up. The civil rights movement had been somewhat overshadowed by the war and Tet, but with Dr. King's assassination of April 1969, there's widespread public grief and riots in over 60 cities. Bobby Kennedy becomes the face of civil rights with his campaign speeches about racial justice and equality. And Bobby Kennedy, we have to remember, is more responsible than JFK for the Kennedy legacy. That is the use of federal government to help the powerless. And Bobby Kennedy becomes the underdog candidate for the Democrats. And just when he looks like he has the presidential nomination locked up, Bobby Kennedy is also assassinated by Sirhan Sirhan. And the Democratic nomination is ultimately going to go to a man named Humphrey, who was LBJ's vice president, and many see Humphrey as simply being LBJ 2.0. And there is going to be violent clash between Humphrey and his supporters and anti-war activists at the Democratic National Convention. All of this is going to be televised, and what seems to be the case is the Democratic Party and the country as a whole is tearing itself apart. As a result, a lot of people in the United States think that the country is on the edge of revolution, and there's a big conservative backlash. George Wallace is going to go ahead and throw his hat in the ring as a presidential candidate, as an anti-civil rights candidate, and he's going to win large portions of the South. But more importantly, Richard Nixon is going to come back and run again, and he's going to run as a pro-middle class candidate, and he speaks about what he calls the silent majority. Those who he believes feel the country needs to go in a certain way but are not out in the street protesting. And he's going to run on a platform of peace with honor in Vietnam and a return to stability and end to reform within the United States. And ultimately, Richard Nixon is going to win by only the slimmest of majorities. So what's the big idea here? Well, there's a lot of Cold War flashpoints, particularly with Cuba, and Vietnam emerges as the central Cold War flashpoint in the 1960s and becomes a mess where LBJ cannot find a solution. LBJ ultimately steps aside. And what we have to realize is that in the space of just 2 short years, LBJ went from being the most successful president since FDR to a president who has failed so spectacularly in his policies that he feels that he cannot, in good conscience, seek re-election. Now, with LBJ stepping aside, the most important thing to realize is that the war in Vietnam ultimately swung the 1968 election and is going to sweep Richard Nixon into power. See you in the next lecture.